down and turn to your right. If you force it, you'll break it. This won't come out, Bob.
Push the switch forward.
A single light bulb is preventing a modern jetliner from landing.
Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
Struggling to fix a minor problem, a much more serious one develops.
We're still at 2,000, man.
Hey, what's happening here?
The plane crashes in a remote swamp. Those who survived the crash face a new danger. The swamp has filled with jet fuel.
No one light a match!
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation history.
The crash would point investigators to an astonishing danger lurking in all commercial cockpits.
Mayday.
December 29th, 1972, the dawn of the jumbo jet era. On its way to Florida, this L-1011 TriStar is the most advanced passenger jet in the world.
The Lucky TriStar was a fascinating bird. It was a beautifully flying airplane. It had a tremendous amount of power and a lot of innovation to it.
The cabin of this Eastern Airlines jet is large and quiet. The service is first-rate. Bob Loft is the captain for Eastern Airlines Flight 401. He's been with the airline for more than 30 years. His first officer is Albert Stockstill. His second officer is Donald Repo. The jet has left the bitter cold of New York behind and is now descending towards Miami.
Welcome to Miami. The temperature's in the low 70s, and it's a beautiful night out there tonight. Go ahead and throw them out.
Angelo Donadeo is an off-duty Eastern Airlines maintenance expert. He's catching a ride back to Miami. There are 176 people on board tonight's flight. Most are heading south for New Year's. Ron and Lily Infantino have been married for only 20 days. They've just spent Christmas with his family.
The seatbelt sign came on as normal. We're in a final approach. I look out the window there and I could see lights at the airport.
Close to midnight, the plane begins its approach to Miami International Airport. Stockstill flies the plane, while Repo performs a landing checklist.
Radar,
Up, off.
hydraulic panels checked,
35, 33.
gear down.
The captain notices a problem.
Bird, is that handling?
No nose gear.
The light showing that the nose gear is locked hasn't lit up.
I'm gonna raise it back up.
The gear might not be all the way down. Loft tries again. The sound of the landing gear echoes through the plane.
It makes a pretty loud grinding noise. If you've flown very much, you're familiar with that sound. So they did that several times. The pilots did that several times, and we weren't alarmed. It's just one of those things that happens sometimes, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, great, we're gonna be late getting home.
Still no light. Loft isn't sure if his front landing gear is locked. If it isn't, landing could be disastrous.
Tower, this is Easton 401. Looks like we're gonna have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet.
Eastern 401 Heavy, roger. Pull up, climb straight ahead to 2000. Go back to approach control, 128.6.
You want me to test the lights or not?
Yeah, check it.
Flight engineer Repo performs a test nicknamed the Christmas tree. It lights up every warning light in the cockpit to see if the bulbs are working. The nose gear indicator light fails the test. The bulb is probably burnt out. But there's a slim chance of a double failure. Both the light bulb and the landing gear could be broken.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
But the troublesome bulb is out of the captain's reach. On the ground, air traffic control directs Flight 401 to climb to 2,000 feet and circle away from the airport until the problem is solved.
You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
It's right above that red one, isn't
Yeah,
it?
I can't get at it from here.
Yeah, I can't make a pull out either.
It's a moonless night. As the plane veers away from Miami, there's total darkness outside.
All of a sudden, it turned pitch dark again. And that means we were going back out west towards the Everglades.
Co-pilot Stockstill is flying the plane, but Captain Loft needs his help to solve the problem.
Put the autopilot on here.
The TriStar is equipped with the most sophisticated autopilot in history. It actually has the ability to land the plane on its own. Stockstill programs it to fly at 2,000 feet.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
The light is finally removed. Richard Pragluski is an aviation engineer. He takes this flight regularly and can tell that the plane is experiencing technical problems.
He was heading out towards the Everglades. I knew there was something wrong with the plane because if you have a delay, they'll circle the plane.
The irritating problem isn't getting better. Now Stockstill can't get the light back in.
Now, push the switch just forward. Okay. You got it sideways then.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 300.
Okay, 300, Eastern 401. Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
The electronics bay on the plane is underneath the cockpit. The room, nicknamed the Hellhole, is a unique feature on wide-bodied jets. The front landing gear mechanism can be seen from there.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this?
Hold down and turn to your right.
Anything I can do it
Now
with?
turn to your left one time.
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob. If I had a pair of pliers, I could cushion it with that
I
Kleenex.
can give you a pair of pliers, but if you force it, you'll break it. Just believe
To hell with it, to hell with this! Get down and see if we're lined up with that red line, that's all we care. Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
As the crew struggles to fix the problem. In the cabin, Richard Pragluski sees something peculiar out of his window.
I could see a tower to my right in the distance, and it looked like we were going into a glide path, which I found very strange.
Pragluski has noticed something the pilots haven't. The plane is getting closer and closer to the swamp below. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is flying over the Florida Everglades. Below it, nothing but a dark, deserted swamp. To passenger Richard Pragluski, something doesn't seem right.
I felt it kind of strange that they hadn't made any announcements. But again, he was still fairly high off the ground. And I figured they would come out and tell us that when they were going to make the landing. So I wasn't overly concerned.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Looks square to me.
Can't you get the hole lined up?
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there. It's always something. We could have made schedule.
Without a green light, they still don't know if their landing gear is locked. Flight engineer Don Repo is now in the belly of the plane. There's a viewing window in the hellhole which should let him see if the front wheels are locked in place.
Ah!
I don't see it down there.
Huh?
I don't see it.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it. It's pitch dark, and I throw the little light and get nothing.
Wheel well lights on?
Pardon?
Wheel well lights on?
Captain Loft has forgotten to turn on lights outside the plane that illuminate the landing gear.
Now try it.
At Miami International, controller Charlie Johnson has just finished dealing with another troubled jet.
National 607 has landed without incident.
Fire trucks were deployed, but they weren't used.
He notices that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 seems to have dropped from 2,000 feet to 900. But he's not overly concerned. It's not unusual to get false readings for several radar sweeps in a row.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Captain Loft believes that he'll soon get confirmation that his gear is locked. He wants to return to the airport.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
The plane is heading west, away from the airport. It will take several minutes to get lined up for the landing. Deep in the Everglades, Bob Marcus is hunting frogs with a friend. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 roars past.
I just saw the lights blinking across the sky, and it was so black. There's no horizon in the west, and you could tell how high the plane was.
Suddenly, the pilots make an alarming observation.
We did something to the altitude?
What?
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
I see the lights in the cabin just flickering on and off, and I heard a noise. It was a violent whipping sensation. Then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose.
Charlie Johnson notices that Flight 401's altitude now reads as coastal, or sea level.
Eastern 401, I've lost you on the radar there, your transponder. What's your altitude now?
There's no response from Eastern 401. Another plane makes a disturbing report.
Miami approaches this National 611. We just saw a big flash. Looked like it came out west. Don't know what it means, but wanted to let you know.
In a dark, remote swamp, those who survived the crash find themselves in a nightmare. Bob Marcus races towards the site of the crash.
Oh, I was going as fast as I could. It took me about 15 minutes, I think, to get to the crash site.
Remarkably, Richard Pregluski is alive.
I knew I was badly injured because I could see my clothes hanging from my body. I had almost no clothes on the upper half of the body, and I could see skin coming down my arms. And I also knew that when you're in shock, you feel no pain. So I knew I really was seriously injured, and I started thinking, I said, well, you know, the pain will come later, but how do I keep calm and get out of there, because the longer I'm in that swamp, and the condition I'm in, the more danger I'm in.
When the plane
I remember that fire coming to my face. I remember the flash. I remember that I tried breathing and I could not get my breath. Of course, the fire took all the oxygen out of the air. And that's the last thing I remember until I got up in the swamp itself.
Ron Infantino was knocked out by the crash. He wakes up in the swamp.
So I was thrown quite a bit. And I was away from Verizon or everybody else. Nobody was even near me. Lily. Lily.
He's badly wounded. His new wife, Lily, was sitting next to him, but now she's nowhere to be seen. Swamp water doused the initial flames. But 20,000 kilograms of jet fuel has now leaked into the swamp. A single spark could start a deadly blaze.
No one light a match! We're covered in jet fuel!
What a sad thing to come through that crash and then have somebody do something stupid like strike a match and have us all just blow up. That was the real fear.
Hoping to help the survivors, Bob Marcus jumps into the swamp. He immediately feels the sting of the jet fuel on his skin.
It burnt my legs. I had to treat my legs for burns for about a week.
Marcus quickly spots a survivor who's in grave danger. The badly wounded man is still strapped to his seat. He's on the verge of drowning.
Had his head kept dropping down in the water. He came up, he said, "Help me. I can't hold my head up much longer," and then dropped back down in the water. So I helped him, I pulled him up.
Don't worry. I got you. I got you.
Bob Marcus saves dozens of lives, preventing many people from drowning. Isolated from the other survivors and unable to move, Ron Infantino now has a new reason to fear for his life.
After a while, the alligators and the snakes, you could hear them in the weeds coming by, and you could hear the croaking of the alligators because they started to come back to the natural habitat. And as far as I'm concerned, if a gator came up to me or a snake, I was dead meat because I couldn't defend myself at all. And then I heard Christmas caroling.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
To rally the survivors' spirits, Trudy Smith and others sing Christmas carols.
We knew instinctively that we weren't going to get out of there in a hurry because nobody knew where we were. In the middle of the swamp, midnight. So what else are you going to do?
And you got to picture us this, I mean, in the dark at night, or you hear us singing in the wilderness. It was like being on the Titanic going down type of thing, you know? It was unbelievable.
Within minutes, Coast Guard helicopters are sent out in search of the crash site. But in the pitch-black night, they can't find the wreckage. Bob Marcus tries to signal the distant helicopters.
But I could see where they were, and they were going the wrong direction. And I just waved the light at them until I saw them turn and head back towards us.
It seemed like we'd been in the swamps for a really long time when we heard a helicopter, and it was such a welcoming sound because that means somebody knows that you're there.
Less than half an hour after the crash, the Coast Guard arrives. But the nearest landing site is 100 meters away. Marcus rushes to meet the helicopter and ferry the rescuers back to the crash site. His first passenger is rescue worker Don Schneck.
I made it to the airboat. He asked me, where are all the rescuers? And I said, this is it, let's go. He took us out into the glades to a point where he said, this is as far as I want to go because I don't want to run anybody over. And he said, there are bodies out here all over the place.
Don Schneck starts searching for survivors.
I approached the large object that I had seen at a small distance and realized it was the nose section of the aircraft.
He's amazed to discover that Captain Bob Loft has survived the crash.
He was in bad shape. He had lacerations, so I knew he had broken ribs. I could tell he was in shock, so I calmed him down, told him, I'm the only one here right now, but they're coming. Just hang in there.
I'm going to die.
He told me that, and I argued with him. Anything to keep anything going. It just made me feel so inadequate because it was just me. I turned around and I looked back towards Miami and thinking, where in the heck is everybody? And at that time when I looked, I must have seen 50 lights coming. And I went, thank God.
First Officer Bert Stockstill was killed during the crash. Captain Bob Loft soon dies at the scene. Angelo Donadeo and Don Repo have survived and are taken to hospital. In all, 77 people survived the crash. 99 people are killed. By dawn, all the wounded have been transported to Miami hospitals. Ron Infantino is one of the many who are struggling to survive.
Priest comes over and does the last rites. So right then I knew I was in bad shape. And it's a scary thought. And of course at that time I'm still asking for Lily, you know, had they seen her? It was such a madhouse there that night, you could imagine.
Lily. Where's Lily?
The crash is headline news around the world. It's the first ever jumbo jet to crash, and it produces the largest number of deaths in US civil aviation history. There's tremendous pressure on investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board to find out what happened.
It was an enormous puzzle because this was the newest, the most sophisticated, the best of the airliners. It apparently was in perfect working condition. So the NTSB perceived that this was going to be a very long investigation that involved multi-level potential problems.
The crash site itself is an important clue for investigators arriving at the scene. The trail of debris is enormously long. That suggests that the plane hit the swamp almost in the same nose-up position as it would while landing at an airport. Its descent was clearly slow and gradual. NTSB investigators have documented the final settings for many of the instruments in the cockpit. They discover that the autopilot was set to maintain an altitude of 2,000 feet. So why didn't it? Maintenance expert Angelo Donadeo is interviewed. All he can tell investigators is the crew was trying to fix a light bulb before the crash. Within days, the plane's 2 black boxes are recovered. Investigators hope they will provide some answers. Before they can extract the data, flight engineer Don Repo dies in hospital. Ron Infantino is given some devastating news of his own. The body of his wife Lily has been found under the plane's wing.
She was just a wonderful person. I was 27 years old, and she was the same age, and it was actually my first love.
Infantino is haunted by the memory of switching seats with Lily just before the crash.
They had swapped seats quite casually earlier during the flight when she had gotten up to go to the restroom. She was thrown into the swamp and drowned, and he lived.
The swamp proves both a blessing and a curse for survivors.
That's what saved most of the lives, actually. Because the plane broke up, it absorbed all the energy. And the mud absorbed it, and the plane just dispersed.
The swamp water is so thick with mud, it also clogs survivors' wounds, preventing many from bleeding to death. But there's a deadly new threat facing some survivors. Their wounds have become infected, contaminated by a deadly organism found in the black mud of the Everglades. The organism produces an infection called gas gangrene. It can kill a person in just 2 days. Gas gangrene can only be destroyed in a hyperbaric chamber. It's a pressurized container that gets filled with high levels of oxygen. The oxygen gets forced into the wounds and kills the bacteria. 8 of the surviving passengers are infected with gas gangrene. Hyperbaric chambers must be found for all of them. The only other way to save patients is to amputate the infected limb. Ron Infantino's arm is badly infected.
Doctor came in and says, well, we've diagnosed it as gas gangrene. He says, we got to take your arm off immediately or have to get you to a hyperbaric chamber. Unfortunately, he says, the only hyperbaric chamber is at Mercy Hospital, and that's all been taken advantage of.
Unless doctors can find a chamber soon, Infantino will lose his arm. While doctors search for a chamber for Ron Infantino, investigators examine what's left of the plane. They test its flight controls, engines, instruments, and its electrical and hydraulic systems.
The plane was virtually new. It was in perfect condition. There was no mechanical reason found that would have caused the crash.
In fact, some parts of the plane are in such good condition that the NTSB gives them back to Eastern Airlines so they can be installed on other airplanes in its fleet. An unused hyperbaric chamber is finally found for Ron Infantino at a Navy base in Panama City. He spends 40 hours in the chamber. The pressurized oxygen kills the bacteria and saves his life.
Gentlemen, we have 3 causes of the crash to explore.
A state-of-the-art jetliner plunged 2,000 feet without the crew noticing. Investigators know the plane was mechanically sound. They now focus on other possible reasons for the unobserved descent. At the top of the list is subtle incapacitation of the pilot. The autopsy of Captain Bob Loft has yielded a gruesome discovery. Captain Loft had a large, undetected tumor growing in his brain. It pressed into the part of his brain responsible for sight. Medical records reveal that between the ages of 50 and 52, vision in the pilot's left eye had rapidly deteriorated. Doctors believe that the captain may have had reduced peripheral vision. The tumor could have created blind spots. As his attention became focused on the malfunctioning light, he may not have noticed dire warnings on his altimeter. Investigators consider a stunning possibility. An undetected medical ailment may have contributed to the world's first jumbo jet disaster.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
Investigators learn what they can about Captain Bob Loft. They interview people who knew him and pore over his medical records.
The investigators heard that Captain Loft, so far as his family and friends knew, had perfect vision. He was an expert marksman. He shot doves, particularly, which are a very small target.
Loft's records show that he'd recently passed a medical in which he was issued corrective glasses for flying. But the evidence doesn't support the notion that his vision was dangerously impaired.
He was 55 years old, and who gets to be 55 without wearing reading glasses? Not many. Dr. Joe Davis, who did the autopsy, told me that even though the tumor was pressing on areas of his brain that control vision, there was no reason to think that it had yet begun to affect those. He felt it had nothing to do with the accident.
Investigators still don't know why Flight 401 started descending in the first place.
Put the autopilot on here.
Could the autopilot, which was supposed to keep the plane at 2,000 feet, have malfunctioned? The plane's computers survived the crash. They're removed and examined. 11 days after the crash, the autopilot computers are installed on another TriStar. It flies the same route as Flight 401. The autopilot holds that plane at 2,000 feet. So why hadn't it on the night of the accident? Investigators will need to explore other leads to find out. There's another question that dogs this investigation. Why didn't the Miami Tower alert the crew that their plane was dropping? The world's first three-dimensional radar had recently been installed there. It meant that controller Charlie Johnson knew the location, altitude, and speed of Flight 401.
National 607 is declaring
Investigators study recordings of Johnson's
Runway 9
conversations.
will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
And discover that on the night of the crash, it was another plane that demanded most of his attention. National Airlines Flight 607 was coming into land just ahead of Flight 401. That flight was having its
National
own
607
landing
is
gear
declaring an
problems.
emergency. Runway 9 will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
As he focused on the emergency, Johnson handed Flight 401 over to another controller. But just as National 607 came in for its emergency landing, the other controller phoned Johnson and handed Flight 401 back to him.
Eastern Heavy's coming back to you. Unsafe nose gear.
No.
At the time, Flight 401 was already over the swamp. Johnson had 5 other planes to monitor. He was also dealing with the aftermath of his emergency landing.
National 607 has landed without incident. Trucks were deployed,
That's when he
but
noticed
they
that
weren't
Flight
used.
401's altitude had dropped to 900 feet.
The way the radars work, still to a certain extent this happens, but back then it was even worse. Coast mode was a very well-known phenomenon. I mean, you might lose the target for 2 or 3 minutes in terms of the altitude reporting part of it, and it goes and gives you some weird altitude, and then boom, it's right back where it should be. But the controller didn't stop there, and this was really to his credit.
Johnson decided to make contact with Flight 401.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
After that brief exchange, Johnson assumed there was no problem.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay,
Investigators conclude that at that moment, Controller Johnson was the only one who could see that the plane was losing altitude. Why hadn't he passed that information along to the crew? US government regulations for air traffic controllers provide the answer. It simply wasn't part of a controller's job.
At the time of the crash, the FAA required approach controllers to maintain a separation of the airplanes. It did not give them a duty to maintain the altitude of the airliner with regard to the ground.
Now investigators try to determine how the plane's own warning system failed to alert pilots to their growing danger. The L-1011 is equipped with an alarm that sounds if the plane goes 250 feet above or below the altitude selected by the pilots. As investigators replay the tape from the black box, they clearly hear that alarm sounding in the cockpit as the plane passed through 1,750 feet.
Did you hear that? How did they miss it?
Investigators closely examine the cockpit transcript to try to understand how the alarm was missed.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Swear to me.
Investigators noticed that just before the alarm sounded in the cockpit, warning the crew that the plane is too low, both pilots were completely absorbed with the landing gear light. The conversation also tells investigators that the flight engineer was below in the hellhole. The warning chime came out of a speaker at his workstation. Investigators begin to realize that the two pilots were unable to hear a perfectly audible alarm because they were focused so entirely on solving another problem.
That chime, which is clearly heard on the cockpit voice recorder, was not registering in the minds of all the men on that flight deck. Not because they weren't trying to pay attention, but because they were tunneled in on this one problem. That's what we do as humans.
Investigators now focus on crew distraction as a likely cause of this accident. Several instruments would have displayed the decreasing altitude.
The major question was, why were the pilots so preoccupied that they were not looking at the instrument panel?
They had to look at the human beings. They had to look at the interaction. They had to look at why no one was paying attention to the airplane as it began to creep out of 2,000 feet. That was scary territory in 1972.
Investigators interview a number of pilots and make a startling discovery. Pilots admitted that they placed a lot of trust in the modern new autopilots flying their planes. They may have become overly dependent on the technology.
Put the autopilot on here.
Investigators suspect that the Eastern crew was so confident in their autopilot that they didn't monitor their instruments as closely as they should have.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
Once the autopilot was on, none of the pilots paid attention to actually flying the plane.
Still got to find out why that plane went down.
Investigators still haven't determined the most crucial piece of information. If the autopilot was working, why did the plane dive into the swamp?
We did something to the altitude? What?
The pilot's conversation clearly shows that they hadn't deliberately started descending.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
So why did it happen? The answer comes in a dramatic form when the NTSB conducts a public hearing in Miami 2 months after the crash. Before the hearing, an Eastern Airlines pilot named Daniel Gellert wrote the chairman of the NTSB offering to testify on his own behalf. He had flown the TriStar L-1011 and noticed some abnormalities.
The world of airline piloting in 1972 was hostile to a pilot going around his chief pilot and his airline and raising his hand to the NTSB and saying, hey, wait a minute, I've had an experience too, because airlines were far more insular than they are today.
Gellert tells the hearing that during a recent flight on a TriStar, he had accidentally dropped a map on the cockpit floor. As he bent down to pick it up, he nudged his control column. He noticed immediately that the plane's autopilot had been affected. The part of the autopilot controlling altitude had been turned off. The NTSB discovers that Gellert's experience is shared by others. In fact, 17 days after the accident, Eastern Airlines tacked a notice onto a company bulletin board and also mailed it to all of its TriStar pilots. The bulletin warned against accidentally bumping the control wheel.
One of the things that we built into all the modern jetliners and airliners is simply a pressure switch. So if you need to take over right now, you don't want to be wasting time down here on the panel turning the autopilot off. You just grab it and the autopilot goes away.
The flight data recorder tells investigators the precise moment that the plane's altitude started to drop. It was 11:37 and 8 seconds. By studying the voice recorder transcript, investigators can tell what was happening in the cockpit at that exact time.
Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
By turning to speak to the flight engineer, investigators believe that Captain Loft bumped his control wheel. He did it with just enough pressure to disengage that part of the autopilot that had been controlling the plane's altitude. Without anyone realizing it, a simple nudge of the control wheel started a gradual descent. On a dark, moonless night, the pilots had no visual cues to tell them they were falling.
It was determined that occasionally, with just a soft bump, an autopilot had been disengaged.
So before the crash, it wasn't part of the training?
A training director for Eastern Airlines eventually reveals that before the Everglades crash, pilots were never taught that a bump could disengage the autopilot. The NTSB comes to a sobering conclusion. The plane crash was due to pilot error. The crew was distracted. They mishandled the plane's sophisticated automation, and they hadn't been properly trained.
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation safety history, and we really didn't know this for about 10 or 15 years in terms of the true import of what it did to us in focusing our attention on the fact that the way we handle things in a cockpit was not only not correct, but it was dangerous.
Investigators also make a disheartening find. When the nose gear indicator light assembly is examined, they discover that a light bulb inside is burnt out.
Go ahead and throw them out.
Flight 401's landing gear was locked. The plane could have landed. The only piece of the plane that failed was a $12 light bulb. The full legacy of Flight 401 will take years to unfold. It will ultimately alter how pilots are trained and how accidents are investigated. But first, the tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 will take a very bizarre twist. As far as the NTSB is concerned, the investigation into Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is over. Several recommendations were laid out to prevent similar accidents. Those include new regulations instructing air traffic controllers to warn pilots when they're getting too close to the ground. But 4 years later, it became clear there was a bigger lesson to be learned from Eastern Airlines Flight 401. In 1977, two 747s collided on a runway in Tenerife on the Canary Islands. It was the deadliest plane crash of all time.
And we're now at takeoff. Okay, stand by for takeoff, I will call you. 1736, report when runway clear.
That accident was caused by a string of miscommunications in the cockpit.
Is it not your off, Doug? Is it not your off? They're on America. Yeah, man.
Investigators established that 70% of crashes were due to pilot error.
Both of these accidents, Tenerife and 401, what you see is crews dedicated to doing a good job, but not realizing that they're human, not realizing how many things can go wrong if you don't appreciate how human beings fail.
By the late 1970s, NASA began to explore a new behavioral science designed to reduce pilot error.
And pilots be on the lookout for any different from behavior when we acquire.
It's called Crew Resource Management, or CRM.
Crew resource management simply means that we're not going to have one pilot leading and everybody else following. It means that the captain has to be a leader and listen to and interact with his subordinate crew members, and the subordinate crew members have to speak up.
Decades later, Flight 401 is taught in aviation courses around the world as a textbook example of poor CRM.
The problem was that we did not teach Bob Loft or Stockstill or any of these folks at the time that when something goes wrong, the commander's first responsibility is to maintain aircraft control and either do it himself or assign somebody.
We're up to 2,000. You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
On Flight 401, Captain Loft did not clarify who should be doing what. Instead, all 3 crew members worked on the same problem.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
It's gotta come out a little bit and then snap in.
With the co-pilot flying, the captain commanding from the left seat, you already had cross purposes here.
It's right above that red one, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't get at it from here.
And you had a light quadrant the captain couldn't quite reach, and the co-pilot could, but the co-pilot is flying the airplane. You've just set them up for a major problem, and guess what? Systemically, we never taught them what to do.
Today, CRM also trains flight crews not to be intimidated by one crew member's mood.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do it with?
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob.
So if the leader is having a problem, in this case with a light bulb,
Okay. You got it sideways now.
and he's really irritated at it, and the co-pilot has now made the problem worse. Co-pilot's not going to be happy with himself over that.
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there.
Don Repo is not going to be happy that he got downstairs to try to solve the problem, and he couldn't see anything, and he's got to come up and report that.
I don't see it.
They're all tense.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it.
And when you get a crew like that tense, it's not to turn around to the captain and say you shouldn't have done that. But this is part of the evolution of what air safety has now learned and been able to teach so many other industries.
The enduring legacy of Flight 401 is the delegation of specific tasks in the cockpit. The result is fewer crashes. There was also much more bizarre fallout from this crash. It seemed that the crew of Flight 401 was haunting other Eastern Airlines flights. For some time after the crash, flight crews and passengers report seeing lifelike apparitions of Flight 401's crew. Many of the ghost sightings were on aircraft fitted with recovered parts from Flight 401. The ghost stories spread quickly. One book devoted entirely to those stories suggests that the ghosts were there to protect passengers and crew from further mishap.
The official reaction at Eastern Airlines to these ghost stories was one of absolute eye-rolling denial in public, and in private, a certain bit of panic.
There are so many ghost sightings that eventually Eastern Airlines removes Flight 401's cannibalized plane parts from all other aircraft. None of those who survived the crash will ever forget the horror they witnessed in the Everglades that night. And 35 years after their ordeal, many of them returned to that swamp to finally recognize the heroic efforts of Bob Marcus.
They have found
We're here today to recognize and to say thank you.
Many of the ones who lived because Robert Marcus was there with his airboat. He saw them drowning and decided that the thing that he could do would be to save the ones he could save. Robert Marcus was the kind of person that I hope that all of us ultimately would be if we were confronted with that sort of thing, but he drew on some special courage to do what he did. He was one of the true heroes of the crash.
Smoke fills a passenger plane 10 kilometers in the sky.
We're on Mayday. We're going down.
Electrical systems shut down as the smoke spreads. The crew tries desperately to land their stricken plane.
We're gonna need an emergency landing. Put your hat on your lap.
We're going to need 5 trucks. They're standing by for you.
What seemed like a small problem at first has become a life or death struggle for everyone on board Air Canada Flight 797. Early evening, June the 2nd, 1983. Supper time aboard Air Canada Flight 797. Captain Donald Cameron has been working for Air Canada for 17 years and has flown almost 5,000 hours on a DC-9. But it doesn't mean he gets to eat first.
How's your seafood? Nice?
Before he can dig in, his first officer, Claude Ouimet, will have to finish.
Good.
The jet is in the middle of a flight from Dallas, Texas to Montreal with a stopover in Toronto. The heavy cloud cover below hides some light showers, but at their cruising altitude of 10,000 meters, the view is clear and bright. The DC-9 is only half full today, with 41 passengers scattered throughout the plane.
Can I have some tea, please?
24-year-old Diane Fadley is an active member of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation.
We have a number of different fundraising activities, and once a year they have a large conference, and at this time it happened to be in Toronto.
Raymond Chalifaux is 23 and recently married. An engineer, he's returning home from his first ever business trip.
It was a little bit frightening both for me and for my wife. I was supposed to be gone 4 or 5 days, so first time we were separated for a long period of time, so it was kind of insecuring for me, yeah.
And a few rows further up sits a growing legend in the world of folk music. Stan Rogers is just 33, but his career is beginning to take off outside of his native Canada.
I think Stan's best-known songs celebrate ordinary people. The songs are really about ordinary people rising to the occasion and becoming heroes on their own.
Just before 7 o'clock, the plane is a little more than halfway to Toronto.
What was that? It's right there, I see it. Right there.
Yeah.
3 circuit breakers have popped out. Like fuses, they protect delicate electrical circuits on the plane from becoming overloaded.
Like a machine gun.
Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The 3 breakers are for the flushing motor in the toilet at the rear of the plane. Cameron decides to give them a few minutes before he tries to reset them again.
You know, sometimes it overworks and overeats, and then the breaker popped, and then it cools off, and then you push the breaker and everything is fine. So put the snag in the logbook, and that's it.
Someone must have pushed a rag down the toilet or something. Jammed it and it overheated.
Cameron thinks that something must be stopping the motor from working properly. But it's not an emergency. Toilets get blocked all the time. Several minutes pass as the plane continues on its way to Toronto. Flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson are busy serving up dinner in the cabin. In the cockpit, it's Captain Cameron's turn for dinner. But first, he wants to reset the 3 circuit breakers. Without them, the toilet won't work. The rest of the flight could get uncomfortable for the passengers.
Pop says I push it.
He's given it more than 8 minutes. But whatever is wrong with the washroom, it isn't fixing itself. In the cabin, one of the passengers complains about a disturbing odor.
Yeah, that is a strange smell. Let me take a look.
Connie Kirsch, a Texan headed for a business meeting in Toronto, is seated at the back of the plane.
I had smelled a peculiar smell where I was sitting. And it struck me as odd. Actually, it was a wiry smell. It wasn't a smoke smell.
A wisp of smoke is leaking out of the washroom. The smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastic takes Davidson by surprise. This is much more than just a clogged toilet. Other passengers are beginning to notice the smoke and the suffocating smell.
Sergio, there's a problem in the washroom. Judy says there's a fire.
Okay, I'll be right there.
Chief Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti is in charge of the cabin crew.
As a precaution, we're moving everyone to 3 rows up.
The smoke is noxious and overpowering. Benetti can't see any flames. He sprays the fire extinguisher into the tiny washroom, trying to coat every surface.
As soon as I saw that fire extinguisher, something went through my mind. There's definitely something wrong. The guy seemed to have the thing under control, so he's gonna do his job and things will be business as usual.
It's 2 minutes past 7, just 11 minutes since the circuit breakers first popped out. Laura Kayama brings Captain Cameron the disturbing news.
Excuse me, Captain. There's a fire in the washroom in the back. They just went back to go put it out.
You want me to go back?
Yeah, go.
A fire on board an aircraft is one of the worst situations any crew can face. The plane is some 10 kilometers high. What starts as a spark can turn deadly in a few short minutes. But at the moment, Cameron doesn't know how bad the situation is.
You got to remember, in 1983, people were allowed to smoke in the aircraft. And there had been a number of incidents of this sort in the industry. So it really didn't alarm me that much.
Ouimet finds the situation is worse than he expected.
I didn't see any flames when I opened the door before, but I sprayed it really good with the fire extinguisher.
You think it was a cigarette in the garbage?
No, not really.
Okay. Can't get back there. Smoke's too heavy. I think we'd better go down.
But Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti has a very different assessment of the situation.
You don't have to worry. I think the smoke's easing up.
It's a confusing moment for Captain Cameron.
Some components do fail from time to time that are not severe or serious enough to cause an emergency descent. That's a pretty serious thing.
When Ouimet and Benetti were at the back of the plane, the smoke seemed thick, but now it appears to be subsiding.
Okay, it's starting to clear now. But I'll go back and check if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Take these goggles. I'll leave my mask on. Go back wherever you can, but don't get yourself incapacitated.
No problem. No problem.
If it's just a broken toilet motor, Cameron can still make it to Toronto. But if it's more serious, he'll have to land immediately before the small inconvenience becomes a deadly problem. June the 2nd, 1983. Air Canada Flight 797 cruises through the early evening. The flight has taken an unsettling turn. Wisps of smoke are gathering at the back of the DC-9. An acrid smell is spreading through the cabin. The crew is growing concerned. They've already moved passengers towards the front of the jet, as far as possible from the creeping smoke. Captain Donald Cameron is waiting for an update from the back of the plane, when suddenly he's got a new problem. The master warning light is on. Electrical systems throughout the plane, including some in the cockpit, begin to fail.
The airplane basically lost all its sophisticated navigation and attitude information. So I was left very suddenly with, I think, 3 engine instruments per engine and 4 flight instruments, which were very primitive. They were what you might have flown a World War II bomber with.
With his electrical systems starting to shut down, Cameron calls the nearest ground control.
Memphis Center, this is Air Canada 797.
Air Canada 797, Indianapolis Center. Go ahead.
Yeah, we've got an electrical problem here. We may be off communication shortly. Stand by.
Co-pilot Claude Ouimet is at the back of the plane. The washroom door handle has become hot to the touch. He doesn't even risk opening it. Faced with a potential fire on board, the crew have no choice but to land their plane as soon as possible.
I don't like what's happening. I think we'd better go down. We're going to be making an emergency descent. Brief the cabin crew. Yes, sir.
As soon as the decision is made, another warning light goes on. They've just lost most of their emergency power.
We're talking about multiple failure here, and it's starting to be complicated. So we're going down, and obviously we have to land.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
A small problem has snowballed into an all-out emergency.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
This is Louisville Control, over.
Air Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
Cincinnati is 46 kilometers away. They can make it. Captain Cameron begins an initial descent to 1,500 meters. The crew has switched to emergency battery power, but many of the plane's instruments aren't functioning.
So all we had left was DC immer power, and that's only good for radios, basically.
It's not only instruments. Cameron finds that a critical piece of his plane isn't working properly. The horizontal stabilizer on the tail of his DC-9 is frozen. Cameron uses the part that's still working, the elevators, to make the plane dive. But like a car that's lost power steering, the aircraft resists. As Cameron pushes on the controls, they push back with a pressure equal to 20 kilograms.
The airplane became very heavy, and I took my total concentration to fly the airplane.
An acrid, bitter smoke is creeping forward from the back of the plane and seeping in from the seams in the fuselage ceiling. It hovers like a cloud over the passengers' heads.
Incredibly harsh smoke that was really irritating your throat. You had to take really, really small breaths, otherwise you would choke.
I could see it rise. It was traveling along those luggage racks, you know, coming forward.
The smell of burning plastic fills the air. Dropping oxygen masks could make the situation worse.
I could have deployed the oxygen mask for the passengers, but it's forbidden. You're only allowed to use the oxygen mask in the case of a massive decompression or loss of cabin pressure, not for fire.
I was crying and scared. I wasn't hysterical. The gentleman sitting next to me explained to me that if I would not cry and if I could, you know, conserve my, not breathe so fast, that it would conserve the oxygen, would help us, and not to worry, that the flight attendants, they really know how to handle these sort of situations.
As the electrical malfunctions ripple through the plane, the PA system shuts down. Flight attendants struggle to shout directions, but it's getting more and more difficult to breathe. In 1983, it's not standard procedure to tell passengers how to open the emergency doors. But in this case, the two flight attendants are taking no chances.
Plain as possible.
As smoke begins entering the cockpit, the captain's situation is becoming critical. For the first time, we met talks to the Cincinnati airport.
Approach Air Canada 797. We're on Mayday. We're going down.
Air Canada 797, Cincinnati approach. Planned runway 36 ILS. And the equipment has been alerted. Do you have time to give me the nature of the emergency?
We have a fire in the washroom. We're filling up with smoke right now.
Say, type of aircraft, number of people on board, and amount of fuel.
We'll copy that later. We don't have time.
Gregory Karam is the approach tower controller. He's the lifeline for the struggling jet. He can't see the plane on radar yet, but he knows it's in trouble.
There was really no mayhem whatsoever, no screaming, nothing at all. In fact, it was very quiet and calm. And again, I was terrified at that point.
Almost 13 minutes after 7, Karam catches sight of Flight 797 on his radar.
Air Canada 797, you are now fully identified. This will be a no-gyro radar approach for runway 27 left. Descend now to 3,500 feet. Your position is now 12 miles southeast of the airport.
The crew needs to be guided in from the ground. Struggling to see through the dense smoke, they could easily veer off course. Karam will talk them down, watching them every step of the way. In the cabin, the smoke and heat are becoming unbearable.
My thought was, well, we're gonna crash. They won't be able to identify myself because I didn't have my papers with me, so I stood up, I took my wallet in the compartment and put my jacket on so that they could identify my body.
I knew at that point, that's when I decided or felt that I was not going to make it because I felt I would never see my family again, and the situation just seemed very impossible.
Stan, he certainly had a sense of his own mortality, and he hated to fly. But the demand for Stan was growing, so he was flying more often. And he certainly had a sense that with so much traveling, his risk is elevated.
Where's the airport?
12 o'clock and 8 miles, Air Canada.
Okay, we're trying to locate it. We're going to need fire trucks.
They're standing by for you. Can you give me the number of people and amount of fuel?
We don't have time. Getting worse in here.
Understood, sir. Turn left now. You are 1/2 mile north of final approach.
Finally, the crew see the airport.
Okay, we have the airport.
The tower has you in sight. You need not acknowledge further transmission from the Air Canada 797. You are cleared to land. You are 4 miles from the airport. Good luck.
In a thick haze of smoke and soot, flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson feel their way along the aisle, trying to reassure the passengers. They can't get past the 12th row. The smoke and the heat are overwhelming.
I was praying the whole time. Dear God, please help us land this plane. Please get this plane safely on the ground. Can't see, can't breathe, death absolutely crossed my mind, but hang in there, don't give up.
I've been married for less than a year and it's already over. So I started breathing as little as I could and start thinking seriously at my wife.
Fighting the reluctant controls, Captain Cameron's strength is being pushed to the limit.
797, the tower has you in sight.
Squinting through the smoke, the crew of Flight 797 land hard. At 20 minutes after 7, the Air Canada plane is on the ground. It's less than 30 minutes since the first sign of any trouble on board Flight 797.
When we touch the ground, I assume that we're safe now. Now let's get out of this airplane.
But inside the plane, the smoke isn't letting up. Passengers are undoing their seatbelts and trying desperately to escape.
I got up out of my seat, and I remember putting my hands up on someone's back, and it was like waiting in a line. And I knew that was one line. I didn't want to wait very long. So I turned around and went the other direction, not knowing I was actually heading towards the front of the plane.
Sergio Bonetti is the first one to the door. He helps gasping passengers escape. The cabin is pitch black and burning hot. In the cockpit, the crew quickly shuts the plane down. The first officer escapes through the emergency window. It's a 5-meter jump to the ground. Passengers have opened 3 of the overwing exits. But even with the doors open, the exits are all but invisible. The smoke is too thick.
I saw a light, and it was the door that had opened. Someone had opened the door. I realized what it was. I ran to the door and held my help. I just put my face out so I could breathe.
Passengers who have found the exits slide off the wing and stumble to safety. On the ground, Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson frantically move passengers away from the deadly plane. Fire rescue vehicles surround the plane. They douse the plane's exterior and the ground beneath with foam, fearing a fuel fire or worse, an explosion. Through the cockpit window, we can see Captain Cameron sitting in his seat looking dazed and slumped towards the wheel.
First thing that got my attention was to see Don's face in the window and realize that he was not completely conscious.
I couldn't get out of my seat. I'd start and I'd get my arse up in the air or like that, and I'd be pushed back by I have no idea, it was an invisible force, but it was probably smoke and fire.
Desperately trying to save the captain's life, Wimet tells firefighters to cover him with foam.
It was this soapy, ice-cold mixture that drenched me.
It works. Cameron stirs and climbs out through the cockpit window.
Stop! There he is! Stop!
Barely 90 seconds have passed since the plane landed, when suddenly the whole interior of Flight 797 ignites. The flames roll through the cabin like a train. Captain Donald Cameron is the last person to get out of the plane alive.
We knew there were people in the airplane, unfortunately, at that point. That was finished.
The cabin fire breaks through the top of the fuselage. Black smoke can be seen for kilometers. Flight attendant Laura Kayama begins to count.
I will remember these words forever. She told us to line up so that she could count the survivors. If there were survivors, obviously they were dead.
Including the crew, there had been 46 people aboard the plane. But there aren't 46 people on the runway.
I really thought that if the pilot could land the plane, we would all get off. But I knew when I looked around, I didn't think we were all there.
The passengers who escaped the plane suffer from smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but most are not badly hurt.
It was almost like if you got off the plane, nothing was wrong. I mean, there was maybe a sprained ankle, maybe someone had a broken arm or something. You made it and you were completely fine, or you didn't make it.
The young man next to me that helped me with my breathing techniques didn't survive. That was a real tough blow, because I know, for one, I believe he played a big part in my survival.
I guess it was around midnight. I decided to call Air Canada. I said, I'm trying to find out if a friend of mine was on this flight in Cincinnati. And she said, are you a member of the family? I said, no, I'm just a close friend. And she said, do you know if his wife is alone? And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, she may need somebody with her.
Stan Rogers, the rising musical star, didn't make it off the plane.
Cincinnati ground. This is captain of the Air Canada flight that's on fire here.
Captain Cameron radios Cincinnati ground control from an emergency vehicle near his plane. He has a sobering message.
It seems there are 23 people left on board the aircraft. Is there a scheduled carrier runs into here that could maybe give aid and shelter to our stranded passengers? It's pretty cold out here.
What began with a simple electrical problem has taken the lives of 23 people. What caused the deadly fire? What went so horribly wrong? The investigation will uncover the plane's troubling history. This DC-9 had another serious accident just a few years before. In June of 1983, a strange smell in the back of an Air Canada DC-9 quickly turned into an all-out emergency. For 15 minutes, passengers and crew struggled to deal with thick, toxic smoke as it rolled through the plane. Flight 797 made a remarkable landing, only to burst into flames 90 seconds later. "23 people didn't escape the plane. Now the burnt shell of the DC-9 sits on the runway at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. It's one of the most disturbing airplane disasters in years. Within the hour, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are on the scene. The first grim task of the investigators is to recover the bodies of the dead. 21 Canadians and 2 Americans. Many are burned beyond recognition. Almost all of the victims are found in the front half of the plane, between the wings and the cockpit. Some are still strapped into their seats. Others are found in the aisles. And even though all the passengers had been moved up earlier in the flight, 2 bodies are found near the rear, beyond the wings.
Because of the dense smoke in the cabin, the passengers couldn't see well enough to find the exits. And 2 passengers went beyond the overwing exits and succumbed to the environment.
Investigators take blood samples from the bodies. They find deadly levels of certain chemicals that were produced as the plane burned.
When we did toxicological studies, we were able to determine that there were some significant high levels of cyanide and fluoride in the blood, as well as carbon monoxide.
It's not known if the toxic fumes killed the passengers. All that's certain is that they were unable to escape before the flames tore through.
When I went on board, I was just struck by the acrid smell. It was kind of eerie because there was a lot of fire damage. A lot of the fuselage was burned. You know, the interior of the cabin was burned down to the tops of the seats.
With the bodies removed, investigators begin digging through the wreckage to try and find the cause of the fire. Among them are members of the FBI.
They were investigating to determine whether terrorism might have been a factor, so they were on scene right away looking at the aircraft to make that determination.
The FBI examines pieces of the plane's floor, samples of water from the washroom, even a plastic vial found on the floor.
The FBI became involved very early because of the possibility of a crime taking place takes precedent over a accident. They were looking for anything that would have to do with an incendiary device or a small explosive device or anything that could be fused to start a fire. They determined that there was no evidence of any crime being committed. It was probably accidental ignition, and so they then left and NTSB took over the accident.
Having discounted the possibility that the fire was deliberately set, investigators consider the next obvious cause: a cigarette. When smoking on planes was still allowed, the most common source of fires in a washroom was the trash container. Investigators examine the trash container and find that the top is burned away, but the trash chute and the container behind and below the sink are intact. Inside the container are remnants of paper, scorched but not burned. The fire could not have started here. With the most obvious potential causes discounted, investigators begin to comb through the wreckage looking for what had started the fire. Studying the history of the plane, Hill uncovers some startling facts. In the year before the accident, 76 separate maintenance issues had been written up in the plane's logbook. All were dealt with, but still, it's an unusually high number of problems. The plane's troubled history didn't end there. 4 years earlier, the rear bulkhead had failed, causing an explosive decompression. The crew had to make an emergency landing.
It knocked out a lot of electrical cable and hydraulics and stuff like that, and the guy did a hell of a job bringing it back to Boston.
The plane was repaired and put back into service, but Hill focuses on the wires that had to be stitched together after the accident. A bad repair job could have been the cause of the fire.
There were wires that ran through there that had been cut, spliced back together.
Investigators study all the wire splices they can find on Flight 797 that weren't destroyed in the fire, but they find no evidence of arcing or short-circuiting. It's another dead end. Investigators turn their attention to the cockpit voice recorder and the popping circuit breakers.
What was that? It's right there, I see it.
Right there.
Yeah.
Like a machine gun.
Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The circuit breakers trip as a precaution. When they begin to overheat, the circuit breakers turn off, cutting electrical current to the motor. It's a safety feature, so the motor won't cause a fire.
Pops as I push it.
Investigators need to know if the breakers were tripped by a fire that had already started, or was the motor itself the problem? The NTSB build a mock-up of the plane's washroom and force the flush motor to seize. They want to see if it could have started the fire. The seized motor reaches a temperature of 428 degrees Celsius. It's hot, but it's not hot enough to ignite parts of the washroom around the motor. As they listen to the cockpit voice recorder, investigators uncover a puzzling clue. 3 minutes before the circuit breakers popped, the recorder picked up another noise. It was the sound of electrical arcing, like static, repeated 8 times. The noises weren't audible to the crew. Hidden from view on any airplane is a river of wiring. Investigators focus on a cable coming from a generator below the washroom floor. Insulation had rubbed off 2 wires, making it possible for sparks to be produced, sparks that could start a fire.
There was evidence that there was some electrical arcing, but it could have occurred after the insulation had burned on those wires.
In spite of countless hours of investigation and numerous tests, in the end, the NTSB can't pinpoint the exact cause of the fire. There simply isn't enough evidence.
Just because of the vast amount of damage that was done in that concentrated area around the lavatory where the fire burnt for a long period of time and possibly destroyed any of the evidence of where the fire actually ignited.
Even if they'll never know the exact cause of the fire, investigators try to understand how it could cause so much damage. There had been heat and smoke, but no one had seen any flames until an explosion ripped through the jet.
When you have a fire that has incomplete combustion, when it has a lack of oxygen, they will produce combustible gases. Those gases then can collect, especially in the crown of an aircraft.
The fire had burned out of sight behind the washroom walls, and the smoke, hot gases and fumes intensified and spread inside the wall space from the washroom through to the cabin walls. Those spaces acted as a sort of chimney for the gases and smoke that the fire was creating. Although the fire remained concealed behind the walls and ceiling panels, the smoke and hot gases entered the cabin through every seam, gathering in the upper space in the cabin and pressing down on the passengers.
The inaccessible areas and the cabin area are all linked together through small cracks and crevices and small openings. The plane is one big pressure vessel with everything being the same, equilibrated to the same pressure. So smoke and gases in those areas would fairly quickly start to permeate into the passenger cabin.
When the doors were opened during the evacuation, an unlimited supply of oxygen was suddenly available to feed the fire. The more intense the heat, the more oxygen hungry a fire becomes. The gas is ignited with the force of an explosion.
And once you have a flashover, you produce heat, toxic gases, and you burn up all the oxygen in the cabin, and it becomes non-survivable.
The technical part of the investigation is complete. But there are still a lot of questions about how the crew responded to the fire.
The first officer says it's starting to clear now, and at that point I reckoned that the fire was under control.
Could they have done more to prevent the tragedy on board Flight 797? In 1983, a washroom fire on an Air Canada DC-9 filled the plane's cabin with smoke. The crew struggled to land the plane, but a flash fire ripped through the jet moments after it came to a stop. 23 people were killed.
There was a fireman hollering at us. I think the quote was, "She could blow at any minute."
NTSB investigators are unable to definitively pinpoint the cause of the fire. But after reviewing all the information they have, they're ready to release their report. The report on the lethal fire aboard Air Canada Flight 797 is published a year after the accident. It's a landmark in aircraft safety, but it immediately makes for controversial headlines. The NTSB points out that the source of the smoke was never identified, either by the flight attendants or the first officer. The captain was never told, nor did he inquire as to the precise location and extent of the fire which had been reported to him.
And with that in mind, what type of fire did you believe that you had?
The bin fire.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday.
And the report asks a hypothetical question.
Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
If he'd begun to descend sooner, could the captain have landed at Standiford Field Airport in Louisville, Kentucky? It was a few minutes closer. The report and the media attention it gets are devastating to Captain Cameron and his crew. Soon after the report is released, there's an outcry among pilots in the industry. They resent its implied criticism of Flight 797's crew and the suggestion that they could have begun their descent 5 minutes sooner. Several months later, the Airline Pilots Association submits a petition that defends Cameron and the crew. It makes an impact. The NTSB release a revised report, including the petition by the Airline Pilots Association. In the petition, First Officer we met writes an impassioned defense of landing the plane where and when they did. The issue wasn't only the distance to the nearest airport, but the required rate of descent. As it was, the plane barely made the descent to the greater Cincinnati airport. Still, the National Transportation Safety Board's revised summary doesn't pull all its punches, pointing a finger at Captain Cameron. The report states that the time taken to evaluate the nature of the fire and to decide to initiate an emergency descent contributed to the severity of the accident. 20 years later, the statement still stings.
I'm glad they were all, the people that got off. I'm very sorry that the people that didn't get off, because we spent a lot of time and effort getting them there. That really bothered me. All I know is that I did the best I could.
Along with the comments on the performance of the crew, the NTSB recommends a host of safety improvements. Perhaps if the flight had been full, someone would have noticed the smell of smoke sooner. But what the washroom of Flight 797 could have used was a smoke detector. They weren't standard throughout the industry, but after Flight 797, attitudes and regulations changed. Even though flight attendants did receive some training in dealing with fires aboard a plane, it didn't go far enough. But what was more obvious, the flight attendants weren't properly equipped to attack fires. Without full-face masks and oxygen, they couldn't be expected to fight fire while holding their breath. In the years after Flight 797, attendants received better equipment and training. The cabin crew had also made split-second decisions that helped save lives. Moving passengers further up the plane and handing out wet towels minimized the effects of the toxic smoke. Their decision to tell passengers to open the emergency exits over the wings was not standard procedure, but it let some passengers escape more quickly and was eventually adopted as a routine practice. Finally, it became obvious from the location of some of the bodies that passengers died because of precious seconds lost trying to find the exits in the pitch dark. What would have made a difference? Track lighting on the floors and bumps along the overhead bins that identified the rows with emergency exits. Features that would eventually become standard.
As a direct result of 797, a number of rules were changed, including a more stringent test for seats, a heat release and smoke requirement for cabin interior panels, requirement for smoke detectors in lavatories, and halon fire extinguishers in the cabin.
Emergency landing. Put your head on your lap. Stay in that.
But the changes were too late for those who died on Flight 797, like the man sitting beside Connie Kirsch. Months after the crash, his wife tracked Connie down.
She said, I just understand my husband was the one that was next to you, and I just wanted to know how was he? What was his spirits? And I said, he was in great spirits. He's very nice. He let me sit next to him and explained to me how to breathe. That was really difficult, you know, and the guilt that I carried for a long time was difficult. But I'm past the guilt, but I guess when you go back to it and you think about it like this in detail, you're right back there.
Stan Rogers was another victim of Flight 797. He would never be able to fulfill the promise of his life and growing career.
I loved his generosity and his loyalty as a friend. As an artist, he was perhaps one of the best songwriters this country's ever produced, and it was really an incredible pleasure and honor to be working with him. He still gets lots and lots of airplay, and so his legend grows.
Sometime after the accident, 2 Air Canada employees show up at Diane Fatley's door in Dallas.
They brought my Bible. It's dark because it was burned and singed, but it's a paperback Bible, and it did not completely burn up. This is just a reminder to me that God was with me. And I believe He protected me, and you know, He was there with me.
Captain Cameron and his crew eventually received 6 separate awards for their heroic actions on Flight 797, including recognition from the Royal Canadian Air Force. But they're all still haunted by the nightmare.
You feel responsible, there's no question. You feel guilt, you're willing to give your license. You feel very, very small until you get all the facts together, and because it's a puzzle for you, you know, you're as much as a victim in this. You're not supposed to fly an airplane in that condition, you know, so you're as much as a victim as the passenger, and I think it becomes all of our problem, and we're all part of the solution.
It's just a shame we didn't get everybody off. It still bothers me.
the time, it was the worst crash in aviation history.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation.
In 1974, more than 300 people died when their plane fell from the sky.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
You couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being.
The key to understanding the disaster is found thousands of kilometers away. An unusual piece of evidence that tells the troubling story of a crash that could have been prevented.
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 12th, 1972. One of the newest members of American Airlines fleet is in Detroit, Michigan.
John, Paige.
Flight 96, a brand new DC-10, is getting ready for takeoff. Captain Bryce McCormick and co-pilot Paige Whitney have been in the plane for hours.
Back there, so when we're in flight, if you can get a chance just to look at that.
Detroit is just a stopover on a flight from LA to Buffalo and then to New York.
You got there? You ready to try one, Paige?
All right, sir.
McCormick has flown the plane out from California, but Whitney is going to fly the next leg. Both men want as much time at the controls as possible. Neither one of them has more than 75 hours flying the DC-10. Few pilots have more. There simply aren't enough of the planes in the air. In 1972, the DC-10 had just been introduced. The plane is the latest advance to passenger jets. Its style and its size set it apart from other airliners. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation has spent more than $1 billion developing it.
In the late 60s, there was a race going among the three major manufacturers of jetliners, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed, to see who could get the first jumbo out. So they got really busy on getting this DC-10 into production as fast as they could. And one of the things that they could not suffer were many delays based on some problem with the design.
American Airlines is one of the first companies to buy the plane. Flight 96 is one of those planes. Just the 5th DC-10 ever built. Cydia Smith has just been trained to be the chief flight attendant on the DC-10.
I was excited because it was one of the first jumbos that we had. And I was going to have the opportunity to fly number 1, which is what I always wanted to do on a big jet.
Okay, you got it? Hand on the wheel. I got you. V1, rotate.
Just after 7 in the evening, Flight 96 lifts off from Detroit Airport. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is rising easily through 3,500 meters over Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I was sitting in my seat, and the captain had turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, and I was making my way to the galley, and I had to go sort of downhill because we were climbing to go to the galley to turn on the coffee. when I punched the coffee and I moved over to one side, that's when it happened. I remember falling over because the plane was like this, but all of a sudden it just went like this. I saw ceiling compartments fall, and I saw things coming out of pockets and everything, and I thought to myself, oh boy. It felt like the last day of my life.
We hit something! We lost an engine here!
In the cockpit, the crew is fighting for control of their jet. The throttles which control the 3 engines have snapped to idle. The plane loses almost all its thrust. The huge jet begins slowing down.
The plane immediately took a huge drop. And the next thing that happened was I was hit in the face with a piece of the plane. My husband was frantically trying to find a stewardess to give me something to put a pressure on my face to stop the bleeding.
Let me have it!
McCormick takes over control of the plane. He and Whitney wrestle the jet level. But Flight 96 has been badly damaged.
Have we got hydraulics? No, I've got full rudder here.
The rudder on the tail, which controls the direction of the jet, is jammed to the right. That's forcing the plane to swing dramatically in that direction. While McCormick fights to turn his damaged plane back to Detroit, Cydia Smith is shocked to see a gaping hole in the floor of the main passenger cabin.
People were asking me, what to do, and I knew that I didn't know what to tell them.
Smith has been able to account for all of her passengers. But flight attendant Sandra McConnell is missing.
Sandra! Can you hear me? Sandra, where are you?
And finally, I saw her come out of one of the bathrooms.
McConnell has to cross the hole in the floor to move to safety.
And almost every step she took, the floor kept collapsing.
The crew brings up power to the engines on the wings. But the third engine on the tail stubbornly refuses to respond.
Center, this is American Airlines Flight 96. We got an emergency.
American 96, roger. Type of emergency?
We've got a jammed rudder. We need to get down and make an approach.
Along with his engine and his rudder, McCormick is also having trouble controlling the elevators on the tail of the plane. They help him move the massive plane up and down. They're slow to respond, but he can move them. The situation isn't completely hopeless.
I think it's going to fly!
American 96, turn further right, heading 200.
Without complete control of the elevators, and with a rudder that's frozen to the right, McCormick has to use his engines to turn the plane. By increasing the thrust on one side of the plane, he can change direction. But it won't be fast.
I have no rudder control whatsoever, so our turns are going to have to be very slow and cautious.
All of the passengers move as far away from the hole in the back as possible. But apart from the cut to Loretta Kaminsky, so far there are no other serious injuries.
Captain, there's a hole in the back of the plane. A hole? Yes, sir. What do you want us to do?
Get everyone ready
For an emergency emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick's DC-10 is badly damaged. The lives of everyone on board now depend entirely on his ability to land a plane that can barely fly. With explosive suddenness, a short flight from Detroit to Buffalo has become the most challenging flight of Captain Bryce McCormick's career. He's down an engine, and he can't move his rudder. As he heads back to Detroit, McCormick begins to slow his plane down so it can land safely. But when he does, his plane begins falling dangerously fast. Ideally, McCormick should be descending at 700 feet a minute. But now he's falling more than twice that fast. 1,600 feet per minute.
What's the sink rate? Sink rate, 1,600!
At this rate, McCormick will crash well short of the runway. He increases power to his engines to slow his fall.
Sink rate, 700.
McCormick has slowed the plane's descent to 700 feet per minute. But to do that, he's had to increase his forward airspeed, which means he'll be landing far faster than usual. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, McCormick talks to the passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We've had a small problem, but the plane is under control now, and we're heading back to Detroit for an emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick was as calm as if he were welcoming you on the plane.
As the plane nears the airport, flight attendants ask passengers to remove their shoes and any sharp pieces of jewelry.
They had to take off their shoes and glasses. We collected everything in a blanket.
Less than half an hour after leaving, the badly damaged DC-10 struggles back to the Detroit airport.
The few minutes that it took to get back to Detroit were the longest minutes that I will ever remember spending on an airplane, because we were sure that we were not going to survive.
Captain Bryce McCormick now needs to give the jet even more power to push the nose up for landing. His plane is still drifting to the right and traveling fast.
I have no rudder to straighten it out when it hits.
The DC-10 with 67 people aboard roars toward the runway at almost 300 kilometers an hour.
The landing was the most frightening part of the entire flight.
When the plane hits the ground, it begins veering hard to the right.
Once the plane landed, it seemed like we just went on forever. I mean, it was just forever.
One set of landing gear wheels runs off the runway and through the grass. After a harrowing touchdown, the plane eventually comes to a stop just 300 meters from the end of the runway.
Okay. Engines off at your discretion.
Shut him down.
Every woman wanted to hug him, and he was just amazing, because it was just at that moment that we all realized that we were alive because of him, that he literally had saved our lives.
If you take a look at something like this and you say, well, there's good flying and there's bad flying, this is beyond good. This is superlative. This is using every instinct you have as an airman and all the capabilities you have to stay calm enough to get the situation assessed.
With the plane on the ground, the crew has its first opportunity to inspect the damage.
The captain and I walked back when everybody was off. We walked back to the back, and we just looked up and saw this hole. And it was just so weird.
There's no indication that the jet hit something as the pilot's first thought. What has caused such damage to the airliner?
The hole was so enormous that if anyone had been sitting in the seats that were there, they would have been sucked out immediately. At that point, they still felt it might have been a bomb.
But while the incident had happened with explosive suddenness, no indication of a bomb is found. As investigators begin their work, they discover that not all of the DC-10 is at the Detroit airport. A coffin that the plane was carrying in its cargo hold is discovered 30 kilometers away from the Detroit airport, near Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Investigators also find the plane's rear cargo door.
Doors are not supposed to fall off airplanes, especially since it was a rather new airplane. You would not expect something like that to happen.
When they examine the cargo area of the plane, they discover that the very design of the door makes it a potential weak spot.
These don't look like they...
Most doors on a jet open inward. In fact, the door is slightly larger than the frame it fits into. As the pressure builds inside a jet, this type of plug door is actually forced into the frame of the aircraft. The design makes the door extremely safe. But McDonnell Douglas designed the cargo door on the DC-10 to open outward. That decision was made to increase the amount of storage space on the plane. When it's closed, hooks on the DC-10's door grab hold of a bar on the plane's door frame. To make sure it's closed, baggage handlers push down on a lever, which drives locking pins through the hooks, which hold them in place. When investigators examine the cargo area of the plane, they don't find any structural damage around the door. When they study the locks on the cargo door itself, they find that the latches are not completely closed. And the pins that are supposed to make sure the door is locked are not in their locked position.
When we interrogated the cargo handler that closed the door, it became immediately apparent that he used excessive force to close the door. And in fact, he said he had to use his knee to get the door handle to go flush.
Investigators make a frightening discovery. It's possible to close the lever on the outside of the door, even if the hooks and locking pins are not in the closed position. Paul Eddy is a journalist who investigated the history of the DC-10.
What Windsor showed is that you could actually pull the handle in order to buckle the top fixture so that the handle went home properly, but the locking pins had not gone through the spools.
Engage the lever.
This means that baggage handlers can believe the door is closed when it's not. Not only can the outside lever be closed without the locks being fully engaged, there's no way for the crew of the plane to know. The faulty locking pins will still turn off the warning light, even though they aren't in their proper position. The door was a ticking time bomb. As passenger jets climb, the difference between the pressure inside the plane and the pressure outside the plane grows. If a door isn't properly shut, it will blow out with explosive force. The problem on the American Airlines flight began as the plane passed through 3,500 meters. When the door blew, the coffin in the cargo hold was sucked out. When the air pressure inside the plane was released, anything that wasn't firmly attached was pulled out of the airliner.
It's a really startling thing if you're not expecting it. What you've got is a lot of air stuffed inside this pressure vessel that now wants to get out. And the bigger the airplane is, the more powerful the hurricane of air leaving the airplane is during that period of time.
By itself, explosive decompression does not make a plane unflyable. So why had Captain McCormick experienced such difficulties controlling his jet? Investigators take a closer look at the back of the plane's cabin and learn that the very design of the DC-10 makes it vulnerable. When the cargo door blew off, there was so much pressure on the floor of the cabin that it collapsed into the cargo compartment below. When it did, the floor ripped into some of the plane's critical control systems.
When it collapsed the floor, it took the cables that controlled number 2 engine, and it took most of the cables, or impeded most of the cables, that had to do with the flight controls in the back.
I think it's going to fly!
It left McCormick just enough control to keep his plane level. The remarkable flying of Bryce McCormick had saved the lives of everyone on board Flight 96. But there was a problem with one of the newest and most expensive planes flying over North America.
In the Windsor incident, there was an obvious flaw. And that's where the NTSB said, look, here is really the smoking gun, the ability to close that thing without having all those locks engaged. Let's make sure we change this system right now. Every DC-10 operator needs to know this.
I want everything checked. I want all the bolts checked first.
Chuck Miller is the head of the NTSB's Aviation Safety Bureau.
You have to check all the latches, okay? Every single latch.
It's his responsibility to point out problems with the new DC-10 and propose solutions. He helps write the fixes he thinks McDonnell Douglas needs to make to keep the plane safe.
He was a very, very professional man, and he had his investigators had enormous respect for him. Chuck didn't sit back in the office. Chuck was always on the scene.
For Chuck Miller, fixing the DC-10 is a matter of professional pride. For McDonnell Douglas, the near accident over Windsor has enormous implications. Their billion-dollar gamble came close to tumbling from the sky. If anything else goes wrong, the company itself could be at stake. March the 3rd, 1974. A perfect spring-like day in Paris. It's been almost 2 years since a DC-10 came close to crashing near Windsor, Ontario. Now more than 50 of the new planes are flying around the world. One of them, Plane 29, is owned by Turkish Airlines. Normally, the last leg of this trip from Turkey to England wouldn't be very crowded. But today, the DC-10 is filling up fast. People are squeezing into seats throughout the plane. A strike at a British airline has passengers scrambling for any flight back to London. Wendy Wheel is one of many last-minute additions to the flight. A model, she's returning home after a shoot in Spain.
We'd been married for 18 months, and we were about to start a family.
I believe the secret of her success for modelling was not just that she was a very attractive girl and good model material, but she was generally liked by all the photographers because she had such a pleasing, lovely, light personality.
With all the new passengers boarding, the flight is a little behind schedule. And it's not only the crew who are waiting. At the back of the plane is baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi. With all the new passengers, he's not sure if there are any more bags to load.
C'est tout. Vous êtes fini. Bien, j'ai l'affaire.
Not expecting any other luggage, Mahmoudi locks the rear cargo door. The DC-10 is set to go. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, THY Flight 981 lifts off into the skies above Paris. London is less than an hour away.
Race control, this is Tango Hotel Yankee 981. We're at 60, requesting clearance to flight level 230.
Tango Hotel Yankee 981, you are cleared to flight level 230.
981, roger.
As it flies away from the airport, the DC-10 continues to gain altitude. 2,700 meters, 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. The huge jet shudders and banks to the left.
The cabin blew out! Are you sure?
Just 16 seconds after the start of the crisis, the crew struggles to save their crippled jet. The nose is pitching down, the plane picking up speed.
Bring it up! I can't bring it up! She doesn't respond!
Passengers at the back of the plane witness a horrifying scene. 2 rows of seats have simply disappeared. Through a huge hole in the floor, passengers can see the sky over France.
7,000 feet! Hydraulics! We've lost it!
The crew discovers that they have no hydraulic power with which to control the plane. Without it, they can't move their rudder or elevators. Even without its most basic controls, the plane begins to level out. But it's fallen too far.
Looks like we're going to hit the ground! Speed!
The DC-10 is traveling almost 800 kilometers an hour. The flight from Paris to London never even makes it to the English Channel. Just 9 minutes after taking off, Turkish Airways Flight 981 becomes the worst plane crash of all time. In London, the flight is listed as delayed. The news of the crash comes out slowly.
I went to the ticket office kiosk and I asked what has happened to the flight, and instantly the look on the gentleman's face behind the counter told me something was wrong, instantly.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
I looked on the television and I just thought, well, I just hope she's dead, because I just saw the carnage of the forest in Senlis, and it was like looking at a First World War trench movie.
Flight 981, carrying 346 passengers, virtually disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation. And the litter of personal possessions, electric wires, bits of metal, bits of bodies, just strewn everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being. I still have nightmares about this, even though it's 33 years ago.
Investigators for the French Accident Investigation Bureau are quickly on the scene.
My first job was to evaluate the scope of the wreckage and to begin the first investigation on the spot. At first I was unable to know what has happened. I was just seeing that a terrible crash has occurred and that it will be a very hard work for the investigators.
Despite the enormous force of the crash, the black boxes, made of 3 layers of hardened steel and insulation, survive. Their contents could provide valuable clues about the crash.
Most of the speculation was that it must have been a bomb, because, you know, you've got a almost brand new, very powerful aeroplane flying in clear blue sky, and it gets to 12,000 feet and falls out of it.
Investigators are called to a field 15 kilometers from the crash site. They find a piece of fuselage and 2 rows of seats from the DC-10. Somehow, they fell free of the airliner before the rest of the plane smashed into the forest. When investigators arrive, the bodies of the passengers who were in the seats have already been removed. When relatives of those who died in the crash arrive in France, they're directed to a small church in the town of Senlis.
One of the saddest sights I've ever seen is in this church. They laid out on tables everything they'd found, you know, clothing, possessions, teddy bears, rings, watches. And then relatives who wanted to were allowed to come and walk around these trestle tables with all this stuff laid out.
They produced a little packet with my wife's wedding ring and rings, engagement ring. It was all pretty battered up, so you could imagine the thoughts that went through my mind.
Since the accident involves an American plane, the NTSB's Chuck Miller joins the investigation. For the second time in 2 years, he's dealing with a problem with the DC-10.
I don't believe that Miller suspected for one moment that the door hadn't been fixed after Windsor.
But it becomes clear that the piece of fuselage found in France is in fact the plane's rear cargo door. It seems like a repeat of the Windsor accident. Miller is left with a haunting question. Why hadn't the problem been fixed?
When he saw the door, of course, saw that it hadn't been done. The fix hadn't been made. And that's when I think his anger became very, very strong indeed.
Miller takes an unusual step. Although the official investigation is just beginning, he gives journalist Paul Eddy an important tip.
I said, have you got any ideas what made the door come off? He said, yeah. If I were you, I'd go and look at a place called Windsor, Ontario.
Hello. I'm Chuck Miller.
Miller shares his suspicions with the French investigators.
Could you please pass these around? These were taken on June 12th, 1972, right after the incident.
We have asked for the report on the Windsor accident, and our American colleagues were also volunteers to give us a lot of details.
Now, we had an American Airlines flight from Detroit to Buffalo have its cargo door blow off.
And he has been very frank and had explained what he was thinking of the Windsor accident.
After all the work done during the American Airlines investigation, had something been overlooked? Was there another problem with McDonnell Douglas's enormous plane? With the information from Chuck Miller, French investigators take a closer look at the plane's cargo door. They make a shocking discovery. There is no new problem. It's just like the American Airlines case all over again. The latches that are supposed to hold the cargo door closed aren't locked. And since 2 rows of seats were sucked out of the DC-10 over Paris, it's clear that the floor on the plane collapsed, just as it had in Windsor.
It looks like we're going to hit the ground!
In fact, when investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, they find that the Turkish flight crew had even less control of their plane than the crew of American Airlines Flight 96.
We need to get down and make an approach. I think it's going to fly!
Over Windsor, Bryce McCormick was able to recover his plane and land it. But in Paris, all the hydraulic systems were destroyed.
We've lost it!
The hydraulic fluid helps crews move the rudder and elevators on the tail. Not being able to control them meant the crew couldn't keep their plane in the sky.
The basic problem was the Paris flight was much heavier in terms of the number of people on board. The floor, when it collapsed with such a tremendous amount of pressure that it literally severed all the cables and control to the back. They had no hope after that point.
You and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about
Shortly after the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Chuck Miller is back in the United States.
Our first witness this morning is Mr. C.O. Miller, Director of the Bureau of Aviation Safety of the NTSB.
This time, he's facing questions from American senators.
A potentially catastrophic design defect.
A special hearing begins to find out how a problem that was identified in 1972 could bring another plane down 2 years later.
Of course, our understanding up to this time, they all had been.
What you've got to now discover is why wasn't that door fixed? Why would a major, venerable, mighty American corporation deliberately do something like this?
Less than a month after the near crash over Windsor, the NTSB had made 2 very specific recommendations. Miller and his investigators recommended that a change be made to the locking mechanism.
Engage the lever.
They wanted to make sure that it was physically impossible for baggage handlers to close the lever without the locking pins being in place. They also suggested that vents be put into the floors of all DC-10s. This would rapidly allow the pressurized cabin air to equalize without collapsing the floor. But in the 2 years since the accident, neither one of these recommendations was implemented.
There is a fundamental problem at the heart of aviation safety, and that has been in the United States for a very long time, and that is that it's the job of the NTSB to discover what's happened and to come up with recommendations as to how to prevent it happening again, but it has absolutely no authority to implement them.
The NTSB does not have regulatory authority. They have to turn to the FAA, as they did, and say, we want these things done. And that's where the system went wrong.
If the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, issues an airworthiness directive, planes are pulled out of service until the proper fix is made. But as serious as the problems on the DC-10 were, no airworthiness directive was ever issued. A so-called gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas stopped it from happening.
The gentleman's agreement is the root cause of Paris. There is no question that if an airworthiness directive had been issued, as it should have been after Windsor, Paris would not have happened. It was an entirely avoidable accident.
McDonnell Douglas assured the FAA that it would fix the problem voluntarily. An airworthiness directive would cast a shadow on the still fledgling DC-10.
The last thing in the world you want is for the public or any of the airlines who are going to be operating these airplanes to think, oh, maybe there's some flaws in this bird. And so an airworthiness directive, especially one that requires you to go back and re-engineer something, is a really horrific thought for a manufacturer.
McDonnell Douglas did make changes to the way the cargo door was built. A peephole was cut in the bottom of the door so baggage handlers could see if the locking pins had engaged. Several warning signs were also attached to the plane's door. The company also made other changes to the DC-10. These included increasing the length of the locking pins and attaching a plate to the inside of the door. This plate would make it physically impossible to push down the lever if the door wasn't properly locked. But each of the proposed fixes had its own problem. Many baggage handlers didn't know what the small window in the door was for. And the baggage handler in Paris read and spoke 3 languages, but not English, the only language in which the warning signs were written. The support plate that was supposed to be installed in the door was never attached to the jet that crashed in Paris. Papers confirming the completion of the work are also uncovered. But no matter what the paper trail says, the fix was never made.
Again, the problem is you don't have an independent FAA inspector coming along to look and see it and then put his stamp on it, because it wasn't an airworthiness directive.
In the years following the Turkish Airlines crash, an enormous flurry of lawsuits are filed in California. The tragic story of the DC-10 has one more surprise in store. It's 1974, and an unprecedented series of lawsuits are being filed against McDonnell Douglas. The families of those who died near Paris want someone held responsible.
As time went by, I learned more and more about what actually happened and realized that it was not an accident as we would call an accident. It was totally avoidable. My goal was to expose these people.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, lawyers who are involved in the case have access to the entire history of the DC-10's development. They're not the only ones who pore through the evidence. So does journalist Paul Eddy.
We were determined to get to those documents and that testimony. Somebody gave us a key to the depository where the documents were, and so at night we would go in and then had a huge accumulated pile of documents to go through in order to find out what they've been up to.
Reading through the immense pile of paper, Eddy makes an incredible discovery. A memo written by Don Applegate the director of product engineering for Convair, the company who'd built the cargo door for McDonnell Douglas.
I think the point when we knew we got them was the Applegate memorandum that specifically pre-warned this would happen.
The memo is a damning indictment of the cargo doors that were being made for the DC-10 and the lack of venting in the cabin floors. It warns that it's only a matter of time before there's a major disaster involving the doors.
The airplane demonstrated an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure when exposed to explosive decompression of the cargo compartment.
The memo, written just weeks after the near disaster in Windsor, recommends that immediate changes be made to the DC-10 cargo door.
You know you've got them. You know you've got them because you know they knew.
During the court case, another chilling find is made. Not only did McDonnell Douglas know about the problem after Windsor, they knew during the development of the DC-10. 4 years before the Paris crash, 2 years before Windsor, the cargo door failed during a pressure test. The company knew there was a problem, but the fundamental design of the door stayed the same.
I could not believe a large corporation, McDonnell Douglas at the time, could do such a thing, could risk our lives, ordinary people's lives, for the sake of money.
Well, in aviation, it's called tombstone technology. In other words, we always have the balance of money. And unfortunately, over the years, it has been true more times than not that we have had to wait until we had enough people die in an accident to say, you know, we really are going to have to spend the money over here.
The Applegate memo and other information that comes out during the court case leads to one of the biggest settlements in the history of aviation. McDonnell Douglas paid over $80 million in damages. After the Paris crash, foolproof changes were finally made to the DC-10 cargo door. And this time, nothing was left to chance. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive that ensured the doors would never again open in mid-air. And it worked. After Paris, there wasn't another serious incident involving the cargo doors on a DC-10. But the plane's history and an intensely competitive industry did have an impact. McDonnell Douglas sold far fewer commercial DC-10s than it had once hoped for.
Most of the pilots that I know who have flown the DC-10 over the years really love the old bird. She's probably a little more clunky than the 747 in terms of her heaviness of flight controls, but it's still a lovely bird to fly.
That's fine, but you can't disassociate either the airplane or the company from the awful reputation that the crash left.
Eventually, McDonnell Douglas itself disappears. The company was bought by Boeing in 1996. In the forest outside Paris, a monument now stands honoring those who were killed on Flight 981. A permanent reminder of one of the most disturbing crashes in the history of aviation.
You never forget. And I've gone on to lead my life for 30-odd years, but I've never forgotten. People to this day think it was an accident, and it wasn't.